was 1957 that we were asked to find a substitute for nylon. And this nylon was used in the flight suits of the aviators. And the trouble with it was that it was flammable. They were in a fire, the suit would melt to the skin. And when it pulled the burnt fabric off, the skin came with it. We started looking at many fabrics and subjected them to the flame contacts and the infrared heat and so on. And in the course of this exercise, we learned about a filament that DuPont was working with. It was called HT1, which was high temperature 1. This material was a filament, and it was very thick and totally unsuitable for clothing, but we figured, well, if we work on it, it doesn't melt, which is a big advantage, and DuPont can make it thinner and so on. So for the next 10 years or 15, I forget what, DuPont and our lab cooperated in producing fabric out of this filament. It had to be dyed green and orange because those were the colors that they needed for camouflage and for everyday use in the Navy. And that took years for DuPont to come up with it, but they did. They finally got suitable to make clothing. And then they had to get a name for this new fabric. And so I didn't know this, but companies convene a panel to find a name, and at DuPont they use a 6-letter name. So because it had the no melting quality, they were going to call it No Mel. And then of course one of the criteria is that you have to spell it backwards to make sure it doesn't spell anything. But that's when it spelled lemon. So they changed it. That's the truth.
This was significant in winning the Cold War. Sputnik was a great motivator for the government, the federal government, the Navy, the Air Force, etc., to start hiring engineers. As sensational as Sputnik was, we were almost losing sight that the Soviets had built deep-diving, quiet submarines. Tremendous threat. Our ASW, anti-submarine warfare aircraft, the P-2s at the time, the S-2Fs, carrier-based, P-2s with land-based patrol. The ASW consisted of, we had some good sensors, but all the integration of the information, of the data coming from the sensors, attempting to be put into information that can be used by the crew, was all knee pad, pencil, and by hand. So how do we make things better? The overarching goal of the project was to make use of upwards of 50%. In fact, I think we got to almost 90% usage through computer integration of all of the various sensors, from radar to sonobuoy, including the magnetic anomaly detector that was out that boom behind the aircraft and all that. And NADC was the development and integration laboratory for that project. So it's extremely valuable.
NADC had so much involvement in the P-2 and in the early P-3 aircraft that in the early 60s they were given a challenge and they were asked to design a new version of the P-3 aircraft. It's funny, a lot of people laugh at it, but they didn't know what the name is, so they called it ANU. And ANU became one of the crown jewels of NADC.
All right, so 1966, you went to NADC.
Yep.
Now, were you, it sounds like you did work on the P3. We know a lot of people worked on P3.
Well, I worked on the P3 for 19 years.
Okay. In what capacity? What were you doing?
Well, I started out in the project called ANU.
Okay.
And ANU was the project which had the responsibility to computerize the P3, and they did all the design work, the selection of equipment, and pre-tested the stuff in the lab, then put it on a testbed aircraft, which was 15443, which was the first, that was the test bed for the first P3C. And I guess that was first produced, I think, in '68,
Okay.
somewhere around that time. The production was, the first aircraft was delivered, I think, in 1968. And that was the first computerized, fully computerized system in any of the aircraft. And at the center, that system was developed, designed, the software was built and programmed there, and Lockheed built the aircraft and installed the equipment in the production, but the software was provided by NADC, and it continued to be provided by NADC up through, I don't know, the 90s.
So in what capacity were you working on it?
Well, I worked on it as a engineer. At the time, worked on the new launching system, which the sonobuoys at that time were dropped out of an open container almost, and closed it up, and you pressurized it and air pushed it out. We designed the system that was called a CAD system, an actual shotgun-like projectile that was screwed into the back of this system, and it shot them, the sonobuoys, out so that they could be launched much more accurately, quicker, and could be recorded by computer as to where they were launched from, when they were launched, and that computerized the whole system of firing sonobuoys and launching them. And that was all done at the center. And so I worked on that part of it for a good number of, for 2 years, I guess. And then I went to the project on several projects that were additions to the P3 to make it suitable for some specific missions, recording the ballistic missile submarines, and actual making signatures of them. So anytime the Russian submarines came out of dry dock, they had been modified in some way, our systems could go and record it and get so much data on it. The data before that was all done by ships. Well, the P3s could go and take so much data that they'd get 3 years of data in 2 or 3 missions.
Wow.
And then that provided a signature. And no matter where they went, we knew which ones were where. And the P3s would track them wherever they went. And each of the additions to the P3C were done, designed, and specified at the center. So it went from the P3C to update 1, which modified some portions to make improvements, to update 2, which was some major improvements in the acoustic system, and provided DIFAR, which was a directional type of listening system. And then update 3, which I was a project engineer on update 3, and update 3 was the last version of the P3s that was produced.
Oh, okay.
And that changed the whole acoustic processing system from the paper system that was used before to a totally digital system, which was much more accurate, much more sensitive.
The center invented the sonobuoys, both active and passive sonobuoys, called Julie and Jezebel, were the
Julie, you know how Julie got his name? There used to be a exotic dancer in Philadelphia called Julie Gibson. I did attend one of her.
It was research, right?
It was
This was research. But anyway, the idea of the sonobuoy was it could make it would be passive and you could make it active. And that's what Julie did. Julie made passive men active.
Yeah, they would drop the sonobuoys on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The logistic supply trail from North Vietnam to Cambodia and South Vietnam. The idea was that they would drop these sonobuoys and then they would listen.
It was an interesting program, lasted a long time.
Oh, no.
So the first big
Right.
program I worked on, as a matter of fact. The reason we were even involved is because we were a lead lab on sonobuoys, which were submarine locator things that they dropped in the ocean. So somebody got the bright idea, well, if a sonobuoy works in the ocean, why wouldn't it work on land? So we sort of made some land sonobuoys. And the way these things worked is they were listening devices, acoustic listening devices, or some of them were seismic listening devices too.
Okay.
In other words, they could feel the seismic motions in the ground. Like if somebody was walking along, they could pick that up.
Okay.
If there was a truck coming along, they could pick that up. And these things were dropped from normally high-speed airplanes, and they dropped strings of these things across known infiltration routes.
Okay.
Like from one of the big infiltration routes was from Cambodia to South Vietnam. That was in the Parrots Beak area. That was a big area. And it was all foot traffic there. And the real interesting part of this is how well these sensors worked. These sensors were designed to be dropped from high-speed airplanes. They had to be, the spec was they had to be dropped at a minimum of 500 feet and a maximum speed of 550 knots, which is pretty fast. That's almost supersonic.
Yeah.
And they had to, in that short a time, be able to turn over and either implant in the ground. That was one way. We had points on them, and they would just stick in the mud or something if it was a field area, or if it was forest. We had other ones that hung up in the trees.
Okay.
The parachute spun around, and we had weights on big long strings, and they went and they hung up in the trees.
Oh, wow.
And that was all developed right at Warminster. All those retardation systems, the systems that stuck them in the ground. We had a spec that we had to be able to work if they were dropped in mud, like on a river edge or something like that, or they had to work if you dropped them in something hard like Tonopah, Nevada. You know, the hard baked on. So we had a telescoping nose on these things that made them longer if it was really hard or really soft, and we had a little thing a metal thing that bent out to slow them down. Then we had a small front of the nose that would stick in the ground if it was really hard. So it was a lot of innovation.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of patents. While I was in Vietnam, I did a lot of my time there at the bases where they had these things going were called duffel bag bases. That was what the program was called in the field. They were all run by the Navy. And you could get, at night you would man all these sensors, and you could see people coming down the trails. I mean, you would see them, you would see the sensors going off, and you knew exactly where they were.
Oh my gosh.
The big problem with the program was we couldn't do anything about it because we didn't have GPS in those days.
Oh.
So the pilots that wanted to bomb these people or shoot them, they were up in the air and it was all black jungle. And all they had was inertial navigation and compasses and stuff, and they had no idea within a couple kilometers where they were. Sometimes we'd call on artillery, and they would miss sometimes by a whole kilometer.
Oh, wow.
So we would scare the people.
That's
we
about
really
it.
didn't stop the infiltration. So if we would have had GPS like we have today,
Oh, yeah.
It would have been a really successful program, but it was never that successful because we didn't have, the only way we could really do something about it is if we sent in a squad of Marines or a squad of Special Forces or something, but that was quite a commitment. They didn't want to do that just for a few infiltrators.
Right.
So we knew that in one of these countries that wasn't involved in the war, that there was a whole bunch of ammunition and whatnot, explosives by the Viet Cong. So over a weekend, NADC people put this helicopter, this long cable, and this towed bird, that's what we call it, because it was towed, and it was a mad bird, into a C-5 aircraft. It was flown over to Vietnam, and I believe, I don't think this is an exaggeration, within 2 weeks, they found the largest cache of weapons buried in a neutral country, and they were destroyed.
You want to read the last paragraph here.
Oh, sure. All right. I'll read it off camera here. The LAMPS proved its NADC pedigree. The LAMPS crew is credited with finding the largest cache of arms and ammunition at the time of the Vietnam War.
Nice.
The LAMPS helicopter returned to NADC with various forms of battle damage, including a bullet hole in the fuselage.
Wow.
Wow. Where is this helicopter today?
Probably in some cut up in some
Back in a
junkyard.
boneyard. Yes. The Cuban crisis. Harry is a photo expert. And during the Cuban crisis, you remember the famous photographs that were taken
Yeah,
of
sure.
the missile locations and what have you.
Right.
Well, one of the Navy planes, the camera system malfunctioned. And it's my understanding that a plane was sent up to NADC and picked up Harry Cooper and took him down into Cuba, Guantanamo, of course, and he fixed the camera and the photographic equipment in the aircraft so it could go back and resume its responsibilities.
I'll be darned.
Block 1 Precision Strike Program. Initiating development of an air-to-ground capability. This is during the Desert Storm type time period, and they wanted to extend the life of the F-14. If I recall correctly, the F-14 was scheduled to be phased out by 2006, 2007 time period.
Yeah.
And by putting on an air-to-ground capability to support Desert Storm type of operations and such like that, they were looking to get additional life out of the F-14 platform. Of immediate concern to make this all happen. This was a case, the ability was actually to modify the second seat in the F-14 to be able to support the air-to-ground capability. It required actually putting in a FLIR capability. It was actually a pod mounted under the wing of the F-14 that needed to adapt the aircraft to be able to support smart bomb ordnance capability. A very high priority program, and we were, Lockheed Martin is the one who proposed the capability. It was actually their FLIR that we used to make this all happen. But the center actually had an F-14 simulator. And the center then came along and actually simulated all those requirements into a F-14 simulator here at the center. So you actually, if you sit in the cockpit here at the center, and looking out, you actually see your entire horizon, and all your displays actually were mocked up to actually give the appearance of what they would be in final design. And we actually had actual pilots, Rios involved here as well. And collectively we decided what the final requirements were for this FLIR capability. And we then documented all these requirements in a final definition as to what we wanted out of this package. We then turned it over to Lockheed. From contract signature with Lockheed, 223 days later, we had 9 fully certified aircraft flying off the Enterprise.
Wow. Holy crap.
Incredible. Don't ever say it can't be done. That is incredible. Again, the center was very essential in this effort, as many other participants were as well. But we actually received, the program manager received the Presidential Award because of the effectiveness of this effort. The actual first aircraft, outfitted aircraft, was down at Oceana, Naval Air Station Oceana down at Virginia Beach, and we were all down there for its dedication, and that was neat.
I'm sure it was.
You make the radio wave low enough frequency, extremely low frequency, it sounds like ELF, and that's what it's called, ELF. ELF frequencies, very, very low frequencies, you can have that get into the water and get down to the submarine. A fellow by the name, now deceased, Dave Zimmerman, who lived in the house next to William Tennant, put an antenna under the water and showed from an airplane that at a very low frequency you could communicate from that airplane to an antenna under the water, which meant that if a submarine was down there you could communicate with the submarine because it had the same antenna. And that was I say 54, it might have been 56, but the late 1950s NADC did that. And what evolved out of that is, and this is something that is rather amazing, it's a program called TACAMO. Nobody knows what the acronym stands for, and after the fact, I think people made up the fact. Take action and move out. That's what they say. But TACAMO is an airplane. Well, it was a C-130, a big, and there are a lot of C-130s around. I'm not good at drawing airplanes. Unfortunately, I have to draw it with my left hand. But the airplane has a big spool in here, and it lets out a 5-mile long wire, because that's how long the wire has to be
For the low,
to transmit,
the really low frequencies.
at ELF frequencies. A 5-mile long wire. Now, the other problem is,
How do you not get that tangled when you drop it?
well, of course, it doesn't come out quite like that in the airstream. Its weight alone eventually will cause it to hang down like this. So, the C-130 aircraft that had been carrying this,
Can you tilt that?
sure,
Get that on.
was designed to last, nobody knows, maybe 10 years or so. And one doesn't come down until one goes up. So there's always one in the air.
So we can always communicate if we have to,
Right.
to the subs.
And the president sends a message up to the aircraft. It's a very repetitive message to make sure that it's not misunderstood. And that in turn lets out the long wire, and it communicates down to the submarine below the surface of the water so that they don't have to come up, because
put me down took me out of the shop and put me down in a room with all these engineers. They all had desks. And I come in there with 2 toolboxes on a wagon and a white apron and a coat. They hooked me up with a guy named Ed Karras. And he was a boot sailor, what they call a boot sailor. He got in the Navy as a plain old boot. And he worked his way up, and he was trying to get a commission. And he was the highest you can get in a chief. Chief warrant, I think it is, warrant officer. But he wasn't commissioned. And he was taking all kind of courses, and he specialized in nuclear energy and nuclear measurements. And he became an ace at that. 1950, they were to build a nuclear-powered airplane. That's the way I got it. It was going to be a seaplane, big. And so the Navy right away wanted to know what effect nuclear energy was going to do from the reactor and so forth, was going to do to the airborne equipment that they had. So he set up this lab. Now, he must have been working on that long before I met him. And he had a lot of things set up and going when I got there. They put me in this room.
Now, this was in Building 2, basement. And it later became, when I was there, it became a secure, what they called a black area.
Okay.
And it was offices, but it was such that it was very secure. And they did, top secret or better work in there. And they made this, they dug this tunnel underneath from that room back out towards Jacksonville Road, underground, actually under the building.
Yeah. Everything you see in there, I either designed it or had it made.
Wow, well, this is a first. I've never heard of this.
Yeah, when I was down here to talk to Charlie a month ago, that's the first I knew about it.
Wow.
And a lot of people don't know about it, I'm sure.
It was tough.
What kinds of, did you build the detectors yourself?
Yeah, I did that, but what I'm telling you here, I set up this lab. All the furniture you see in here, and to handle these isotopes. We bought the first radioisotopes from Oak Ridge that were ever released.
1960, I started working here.
Tell us a little bit about some of your early projects and what kind of work you were doing.
Well, I started working in what was then, I guess, the vision section.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. How did an experimental psychologist end up working in vision?
Well, psychology is a study of behavior, and one of the most important functions in guiding behavior is vision.
Oh, yeah.
So, and people who don't have vision have to learn how to function without that one sensory input, which is a very important sensory input, but people learn how to function without it. The important thing as far as the vision section, which eventually became the vision branch and then the vision laboratory after I became the head of it, the vision is extremely important for pilots of high-performance aircraft.
Sure.
And we were looking at issues that might threaten the lives of those pilots. As long as you're flying high and in no disturbance, they can function without vision for probably several minutes. But at a critical point in a high-performance maneuver, loss of vision can be fatal. And so we were looking at things which might produce loss of vision at a critical point in a mission. And that might be exposures to bright flashes of light. It might be exposures to accelerations which produce gray out and blackout, but not loss of consciousness, just loss of vision. And so those were the kinds of issues that we were looking at. And the question was how to provide protection against that type of vision loss. And of course, for the acceleration part of it, the pressure suits were the thing that provided protection against gray out and blackout, because it prevented or ameliorated the loss of pressure, blood pressure, which supplied pressure to the eyes. The pressure suit increases the blood flow to critical sensory areas, the brain, and lots of other parts of the body. But it also increases pressure in the eye, to the blood vessels in the eye, which ameliorates to a great extent the effects of acceleration on vision. The other thing, which is not quite as easy, not that that's easy to do, but not quite as easy to do, is to prevent changes in adaptation, dark adaptation in the eye because of flashes of light. If you think about what happens when you walk into a movie theater, when you are light adapted, you walk into the movie theater and it takes a while before you can see anything but the screen if the movie is on. And that's because dark adaptation takes a much longer time than light adaptation. When you come out of that movie where you've been dark adapted for a couple of hours and walk out into bright sunlight, momentarily you can't see, but quickly you can see. So if you are dark adapted and your pupil is wide open and you're exposed to a flash of light, quickly you you lose a good bit of dark adaptation and you can't see.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're a pilot, you need to see. You can't afford to lose vision for a second or two even.
Mm-hmm.
So we studied the effects of flashes of light. The problem is how to prevent too much light from getting into the eyes of a person who's at a critical point in anything.
Right.
And so those were the kinds of issues that we were dealing with, and looking at the different sources of flashes of light, things like that. The other flashes that we were concerned about were flashes, at that time people were very concerned about the possibility of nuclear war.
Right.
And the flashes from a nuclear explosion
Mm-hmm.
reach very, very high points of intensity. So that was a concern. It needed to be protected from actual damage, which you'd be concerned about with the infrared, as well as with the visual part of the spectrum.
But practically speaking, most acutely, it's just being able to see, recovery
To
of
be
that
able
vision.
to see, and the other thing, you'd be concerned a little bit about the ultraviolet part, because exposure to ultraviolet light can do very serious damage to the cornea
Mhm.
and the anterior parts of the eye. And so that was a concern, but the major concern was the difficulty from the visual and infrared part of the spectrum, because those could destroy the vision immediately. Oh, and then later on, with the development of lasers, there again was a significant visual threat. And so we were looking not only at the causes of loss of adaptation, but what kinds of things might protect against the loss of adaptation. And as far as the infrared is concerned, you can put a filter on, because they don't need infrared light in order to see, but they need light in order to see, and that's the visual spectrum. And so we looked at things like rapidly changing filters, which would change to prevent a flash, a sudden appearance of light, and then clear up again very quickly, because you don't want the protection to blind you if it doesn't clear up quickly enough. So trying to define the parameters that are protective, some protective instrument should provide. We also looked at the use, and this was purely pilot driven, the use of night vision goggles for enhancing vision at night. And the night vision goggles had been developed for ground troops.
Okay.
They didn't have to worry about missing a mountain or something like that. So we set up some experiments, and one of the researchers in my lab went out to set up a night vision training facility for the Marines. The Marines were the main ones pushing for that at Yuma, Arizona. So he went out and established a training facility. And also we did some work to try to determine what kind of parameters they should be concerned about for pilots of high-performance aircraft using these things that were designed for ground troops, people walking around with them, not flying high-performance airplanes.
So you were in Crew Systems at that time, but it wasn't called Crew Systems.
Yeah, I was in Crew Systems. My boss and the rest of the branch were located here, and a few of us were located in Philadelphia. But I was, even though we were detailed to Philadelphia, we were still employees at the Naval Air Development Center.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, I was down here from 1970 and 1976. And they hired me to be the site engineer of a horizontal accelerator facility. We had a horizontal accelerator in Philadelphia, which was built in the 40s. And it's a crash simulator type of device. You've probably seen this on TV where they do ads for crash test dummies, and you see the crash test dummies being subjected to forward crashes.
Yeah.
That was the type of work we did. Okay, I was responsible for the complete site operations and conducting all the test programs. We carried out a number of impact studies, not only for the Navy, but for the Army, the Air Force, NASA, DOT, and private contractors.
What types of impact stuff were you testing? Were these ejection seats? Were they?
No,
I mean, like-
no. There were actually some tests were done on restraint systems, new restraint systems, and ejection seats, and also helicopter seats.
Okay.
Because part of the requirement of an ejection seat is that it must withstand a forward crash loading. And the same thing with a helicopter seat. It must withstand a certain amount of loads when you load it with a test dummy. So that if a jet say crashed, like a low-level crash, the seat wouldn't tear off the rails, the bulkhead where the seat is mounted. So same thing with a helicopter seat. We had to make sure that the restraint was able to hold the test dummy in the seat and nothing broke.
When you did these tests, were they always done with test dummies, or do you also use human subjects?
Okay, I'll get into that in a minute. Okay.
Fair enough.
Some of these experiments required the use of human volunteers. Okay. In this role, I was responsible for ensuring the successful and safe completion of the test programs. Most of the testing was done with test dummies. A small portion was done with human volunteers. As site officer, I was responsible for the man rating of the facility. As I said, the Bureau of Medicine had to approve our facility for the use of human subjects before we were allowed to begin. And we had to carry out the program in accordance with the test protocol that they approved. These programs included the buildup of the test mannequins or dummies, data acquisition, instrumentation, high-speed photography. We did medical and physiology monitoring, site safety, and the fabrication and installation of all the necessary test fixtures.
It was a big deal.
Yes,
Big
it was.
program.
Yeah, it really was.
Were there other facilities like this in the United States, or was this fairly unique?
There were other facilities in the country. The only facility that I remember that did man testing was at Holloman Air Force Base. Now, the Daisy decelerator, as compared to our accelerator, they would send it down the track and they'd have a long probe, and that would go inside of a cylinder. And that's what created the acceleration. It would come to a fast stop. Whereas in our tests, we did acceleration where the subject was sitting still, and we fired the sled out. It's the same response as going into something or being fired, and you still go into the restraint. So it's the opposite, but the same effect. Okay, so in addition to all this, I was responsible for scheduling and coordinating all the participating activities and performing electronic and photographic data analysis in order to determine if the equipment was acceptable and whether we had any failure modes and the kinematics of the human and mannequins. What I meant by the kinematics is we always measured the motion of the test dummies and the humans. Wow. Yeah, I was stationed in Philadelphia when they disassembled the tower. I remember the trucks coming in and bringing it up here.
Do you know anything about how that ejection tower was acquired? I understand that it was built by the Martin
Baker Company is the world's biggest ejection seat designer and manufacturer. They're located in England. I forget where in England. And they had a tower that they used in England. Okay. And as far as I know, we bought a tower from them in, I guess, the mid-1940s. Is that when it was first installed?
I think that's right. One of the earliest blueprint I found was 46.
Okay. Yeah, we bought it from them, and it was assembled. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Martin Baker Company.
All right.
The question I've always had, and we'll let you get back to your comments in a minute, but it seems to me that disassembling the tower and reassembling it must be an incredibly expensive project. I'm just wondering, wouldn't it have been more cost efficient to just build a new one? Apparently not.
It may, well, yes, but it may have been that Martin Baker wouldn't manufacture it anymore. We bought it from them. They shipped it over here. It wasn't built here.
Right.
So I don't know the answer to that.
I've always just been curious about that, but anyway, I'll let you go on with what you were sharing with us.
Okay.
So then they gave me my own little lab across the hall. And over the years, and we're talking, the technology started to ramp up a little bit. We were getting new. One of the things we had was microwave audio and video transmitters. So led the technology for that in the original shuttles. They were putting them in the helmets, these little canisters, and they were transmitting video and audio for. So we came up with an idea, and I got into this video concept. What can we do with these video cameras, these little things? We came up with an idea that we could put them on a model airplane. We got a couple of these little cameras, and I knew somebody at NASA, and I said, "You have some microwave stuff?" He says, "Yeah, we took them off the shuttle in the helmets." He says, "You want them?" He says, "A little tin, I'll play with them." So I started receivers for them, the little boxes with the receivers, and we wired them up, and these little cameras, and we could see video across the room. Now, again, it was so then we decided, well, we got to mount it on something. So that was building these 120-inch wingspan model airplanes. That was the head of the West Jersey Radio Control Club. His name was Ray McCoy. He passed away. And started an idea that we could buy 6 of these model airplane kits. They were kits. I need pieces to make it bigger, and we have to make the structure of the fuselage to hold the. We had batteries in there. We had servos. We had transmitter. We had antennas and everything. I mean, I can do that. I said, "Really?" I said, "I'll hire you as a contractor to do it." All the parts home with them too, because he had a shop in the basement, and I started building this airplane. We used to go over to Jenks. Then we found we had to have an engine for it because they didn't come with engines back then. So I started looking at chainsaw engines. And I took them, and we had somebody in the shop mill out the chainsaw and put a hub on it with a spindle. And then Ray modified it and made it, and he bought these huge blades for the propellers that we found.
That's cool.
They were like from all these kits. Then he came up with an idea back then, because the wings were just balsa wood, and then you put that iron-on coating on it. He says, "You know what?" He says, "There's things called carbon composite." Oh my God. He says, "I can iron that on." He says, and "That'll make it the structure." So I went out and bought sheets of this carbon composite.
This was in the mid-70s.
We went over to his house, and he stood on the wing.
And you can
It was
believe
balsa wood. That
Yeah.
was balsa wood then.
Right.
Nobody had anything else.
Right.
He stood on it. He says, "Look, carbon composite." He says, "I put that on." So finally, we had, and I don't know how we called it, Robin. And I think maybe the models were called Robins. I don't remember. And so we had to go down over to Jersey with a Navy truck to pick up the first.
Robin.
He had it done. Then we were going to bring it back from the lab and he put the servos in and some of the mounting stuff in there. But we had to put the electronics in there and get it done. Okay. So we went over to Jersey with this Navy truck, and 3 of us, we couldn't get it out of the freaking basement. He forgot that his basement went up and made a turn.
Oh, jeez.
Oh, jeez, now what do we do? 2 hours to try and moved his refrigerator and everything out of the way till we could make that turn with this 120-inch wingspan.
Oh, that's great.
And we're all standing there laughing because we were ready to pick it up and go back.
Right.
Go home. He was going to follow us back. we can't get. And then he came over like the next day, and we started putting electronics in it. And it might be in one of the pictures, a little plastic cup, like a pod for the camera. It was made this little pylon that went down in this little plastic thing. And then we wired it in, and we made a little antenna out of a piece of wire. It was the best little antenna. It was unbelievable. Because someone taught me how to in, and the damn thing worked. We got a picture. We need this thing. Okay. Now I went through almost a month's worth of, back then, of permissions to get on that freaking airfield. Nobody let me on the freaking airfield because there's P3s going in and out, and F-14s and F-whatevers. I remember going to the captain and I said, hey, I did all this work. I need to get over there. So he called somebody over there and said, look, we'll figure out how we're going to do this. They'll have walkie-talkies. They'll talk to the tower. It's only and you'll just tell them what times that they can do this for an hour, and there's no P3 traffic coming in, or no aircraft inbound or outbound. Nobody's, it's like certain days over there was nothing doing. It was like, okay, we got one. We used to get a call in the morning. Okay, you can have it for an hour. Okay, great.
Here's your slot.
We built ourselves this little van. I bought a used Navy van off of the excess list, and we outfitted. I bought carpeting on my own nickel. I bought and we made paneling inside, and it was a little white van, just and it was big enough to hold. We put our stuff in there, and we had this van, and off we went across the street. And we used to have the walkie-talkie, the tower radio. I used to pick it up on the airfield, and robbing out, right? So it was like we had some co-ops, and they loved it because nobody had done this before. Nobody ever flew anything like this in the world. I was the first one to do it. I came up with this idea, and it was going to work. So I remember the first time we had this Robin sitting there, and we were all nervous as can be because we never flew through this. We got him out, and Ray's taxiing up and down the runway, and he's going back. I said, are you ready yet? No, not yet. I'm not ready yet. Okay. And he's checking the ailerons. He had ailerons moving and tail moving in and out. Okay. All right, I think I'm ready. So the co-ops, we all sat there and prayed. I remember that. We just sat there and prayed that nothing would happen to this bird, and we wouldn't lose it over Street Road or Bristol, or it'd disappear, because, oh my God, we had to follow it in the truck, because it was flying, I don't know.
Right, you guys would be
So
the new...
we cleared with the tower that we're going to launch this thing, and they're
the latest
laughing.
UFO sighting.
Yeah, they were laughing. I heard the guys in the tower laughing. I said, goes down the end of the runway, and he had to see it, to play with the controls. And it starts coming down the runway faster and faster, and this blade is turning, and all of a sudden, it lifts off.
Oh, cool.
It lifts off. It goes up towards Street Road, and he turned it around. And see, we weren't allowed to go beyond the airfield. We did, but we weren't allowed to go. And Ray's flying this thing. And all of a sudden, we had a picture from the airplane coming down to the ground. And the kids were screaming, look, I got it, look. And we were following, and the antenna worked like a champ. We were following this thing, and it was buzzing around, and it worked. And we were screaming, because this was the first model airplane that had a video connection at 120 inch, what we call now reconnaissance on an airplane.
Our office was right here in Building 2, right here in the back corner almost. And then the range consisted of, at the time, 3 buildings out there.
So what's the point of putting the planes up different ways?
Well, the type of work we did was to, it was multi-purpose. We did a couple things. One thing is where we tried to, if there was a problem with an aircraft, with a system on an aircraft, and some of the antenna systems were multiple antennas, And I don't know how much you know about antennas, but an antenna works on this table differently than it would if you mounted it to the plane. So the characteristics of the fuselage would impact the performance of the antenna. And the antenna the plane banking and doing all of its maneuvers could influence what the antenna actually sees. So for instance, for a simplified example, if you had a guided missile and the antenna for that was in a location where when you banked, you lost line of sight to the missile, then obviously that would be a potential problem, something you should know. But the systems on the airplanes got significantly more complicated, and sometimes there was interaction issues that the fleet was experiencing. They didn't even know they were experiencing problems, and they couldn't tell you what. Well, we would mount those same antennas. We would hook up the system on the full-scale aircraft, and then maneuver the airplane in different ways to try to duplicate how the problem was seen, and see if we could see it, and look at the patterns of the antennas and things like that, and see if we could identify the potential. The reason it was upside down, and it was probably upside down most of the time, was because it allowed us the free space, the 180-degree free space above the plane looked like it was flying, so there was no obstruction. So if it was upside down, we were looking at antennas on the bottom of the plane, and if it was right side up, we were looking at antennas on the top of the plane. As it turns out, there was more times than not, it was probably upside down. But each plane had the capability to be mounted both upside down and right side up.
So it was certainly noticed by the community.
Yeah, yes, it was. It was a big thing. In fact, towards the end, the Reflector, we wrote an article, and that was the lead-in for the article, essentially. That was because it was such a community landmark as such, and everybody had their own opinion of what it did. Nobody knew. People who worked there didn't even know. Mm-hmm. Some of them knew, obviously, but for the most part, everybody had an opinion of what we did there, and very few people had it right. So we wrote that article, I don't know when it came out, but it was essentially clarify what we did out of the range.
We were the lead. This is the lead lab for developing and qualifying ejection seats and crew escape systems for Navy aircraft. After the Challenger disaster in '86, we were tasked to be part of a team to look at putting retrofitted ejection seats in the Challenger. So that was really interesting. I got to be part of that team. That was fascinating. There was a big push to try and get the shuttle flying again.
Yeah.
And one of the recommendations of the Rogers Commission was that they have some type of crew escape. So although it was very limited crew escape, it said I think only in gliding low speed flight, right, under control. I was on the team that was looking at ejection seats, and so we did quite a bit of study. In fact, I have the one report we did, phase 2 shuttle escape system seat study that came out of Warminster here. There was teams looking at ejection seat, there was teams looking at manual bailout, there was teams looking at what we call extraction motor, which is a very simple motor, solid rocket motor attached like a bungee cord that would literally pull you out, but it's a lot lighter than an ejection seat, but it's also very limited in its speed capability, things like that. So we had come down with some recommendations. You could typically, I think the maximum crew they were taking on the shuttle was they were taking up to 7 on the shuttle, and we said that you could probably get 4 seats in there, at least 4 ejection seats, maybe 5 pushing it, and then you'd probably give them a much better chance of getting out. But when NASA looked at it, they said, no, we don't want to reduce the crew size. We want to still take 7 people, and they didn't want to take the weight and time that it would do to put ejection seats in there. And I understand. I mean, it was when you try to retrofit something like the space shuttle with the escape system after it's been designed and flying, it gets very difficult, very expensive. I believe I saw estimates to put a full escape system in would probably been $1 billion. Another 5 years before the shuttle flew.
Yeah.
So to really do an escape system correctly, it should be designed in right from the beginning.
Right.
So yeah, that was an amazing program to work on. We worked with the astronauts from Houston. There was a guy he used to work here. His name was Jim Basian.
Yeah.
And he was an astronaut, and he had worked. I think he went to Drexel, then he went to med school, and then he did some work here while he was going to med school with the physiologist here. And then by the time we got 86, he had already flown on the shuttle once or twice. So he came back up here a couple of times. A lot of guys remembered him. He was a really nice guy, great guy. Actually got to get inside the Enterprise shuttle, which was the one that they used for the suborbital flights back. It never flew in space. It actually had ejection seats in it for the suborbital flights. It had Lockheed ejection seats in it.
Yeah.
So we wanted to go take a look at how the structure was in there, what kind of structure they put in there. So it was literally down at out of Dulles Airport before they built the new center, Hazy center. And we were able to get inside. And we also got to go down to NASA. You can see since it was suborbital, it was the whole inside was pretty much just stripped. And it has two decks. The orbiter has two decks. And that was the other thing that was difficult with the escape system. You had people on the lower deck, you had to try and get them all the way up and get them out. We had a dual rail system. We had come up with an idea that we thought would work.
The NADC airplane is circling, and all of a sudden, from the Soviet Sovereignty, which is kind of like a destroyer in the Soviet Navy, and they illuminate the P-3 aircraft with a laser. Now, for 2, 3, 4, 5 years previous, there had been instances where bad guys were illuminating other aircraft with lasers and hitting the cockpit. And what it does is, if you only get a glancing blow, they call it a dazzle. It's kind of like a whiteout in a snowstorm. The pilots can't see anything for a short time, but their eyesight will come back. But if you hit them strong, then you could be in trouble. The guy could be blind and not be able to handle the aircraft. So sure enough, there was a camera system in the back of the aircraft that Harry Cooper had worked on. And some young sailor had a presence of mind to turn the camera system on and caught 7 pulses of a laser coming up at the American aircraft. He had proof positive. Ronald Reagan was president at the time. The Defense Department was infuriated. The administration called a press conference, and they were going to denounce the Soviet Union for illuminating the cockpit of the American aircraft and the hazard that it could have caused. But we had to make sure that we knew what we were doing, so now we could see the pulses, but we didn't know what the amplitude was. I mean, or was it enough that it could do damage? So we had to get the tape calibrated. So Harry Cooper, he went to the Army and he got a red ruby laser, which is what the Soviet ship had used against us. And they put that into the Air Force truck on the farm in Buckingham and took the camera out of the aircraft and put it on the roof at NADC and shot into NADC. Except, before they shot it, they said, wait a minute, we can't do this. If somebody happens to be looking out the window or maybe up in the roof getting the smoke, they're going to get blinded. Or they could get blinded. So we suddenly had somebody smell gas in the building, and that whole side of the building had to be sent home for the afternoon. We could see that it was not a dangerous laser. We found that out on the afternoon before Ronald Reagan was due to have his news conference and castigate the world and the Soviet Union. And they called it off. They called the news conference off. That was a neat job. And
that's pretty cool.
Harry Cooper was awesome in that job.
In my opinion, NADC was one of many American and research centers, not to even mention the private companies that we worked with, or the aircraft companies who we worked with. We stood up to the submarine threat, which was a major threat, and I think it would have panicked the civilians if they had thought about it. That the Russians had invisible launching platforms for submarine-launched missiles, which if they had carried nuclear warheads, could have vaporized our East Coast from Boston down to Washington or even further with no notice. NADC helped to convince the Russians that militarily they couldn't defeat us in a conventional war. That our equipment was better than anything that they had developed.